Thanks for staying with us here on The Real Story. The Connecticut General Assembly will take up a vote this coming week on possibly adding $40 million to this year's special education budget. This comes as Governor Lamont has pledged to take some of the financial burden away from municipalities, which have struggled to meet the rising demand for programs, staffing, and services. Joining me now to break it all down, State Senator Sujata Gadkar-Wilcox, Senate Chair of the Select Committee on Special Education. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, as we said, you're serving as Senate Chair on the Special Education Committee. I know you did a listening tour recently across the state. So I want to start off, just kind of lay out for us, what are you seeing, what are you hearing from students, teachers, districts about what they're facing right now?
Absolutely. So first, because we have this new Select Committee on Special Education, and this issue has been identified as a priority for both the House and the Senate. And one of the things we really wanted to do was to make sure we are going into communities to hear those needs, as you mentioned. And what was interesting is we tried to get to all corners of Connecticut, and we heard a lot of similarities. So we heard a lot of shared concerns. So our first stop was in Norwich, and then we were in Winsted, then we were in Bridgeport, and then we had one in Hartford, which was open on Zoom for anybody that couldn't come to the actual physical locations. And so the first thing I should say we heard is people just felt appreciated, one, that we were willing to come into the community, and two, that their needs were being heard. So parents testified about not really understanding the process, sometimes feeling like they had to battle with the school districts. The question of an ombudsman came up. School districts, of course, mentioned funding is always a problem. School districts, of course, mentioned the sort of crisis that they're facing when it comes to their current budget, but projected, spending going forward. And we learned that outplacement costs for students have been on the rise, and even though the allocation from the legislature has actually increased, so over the last 10 years, it's increased by $50 million. So schools are actually getting more, but their costs have increased, and so the costs have actually outpaced the increase in funding.
Not keeping up, right?
Exactly. So one of the things we heard from every single district was this question of transportation costs for students who now have to, one, they're traveling an hour, but they're traveling to an outplacement program that can actually meet their needs, which of course is the most important thing, because we have a constitutional and a moral obligation to meet the needs of all of our students when it comes to education. But we have to make sure that's manageable within the budgets. So we heard a number of those shared concerns from teachers. We heard, we know we have a crisis in shortage of teachers in Connecticut, especially in special education. With increasing caseloads, with sort of a lack of paraprofessionals that are in the classroom, paraprofessionals who've said, we don't have a living wage. My mom's a paraprofessional, so I know it's a lot of hard work, and can we think of a living wage? So we heard from basically every interest group, I would say every stakeholder. We heard from parents, we heard from students, we heard from superintendents, we heard from members of boards of education, and we heard from teachers. And what was incredible to me is, that everyone agreed that we're at a crisis level, and we need to act now. And that's what we're doing as a committee.
So this announcement of the additional $40 million in special education funding, this would be for this fiscal year, because I know a lot of people know that right now the legislature is working on crafting the next two-year budget, but this would, for the next 2 fiscal years, but this would be for this fiscal year. So talk me through first, where is this money coming from?
Yes, so we still have 4 months to go in this budget cycle, and there is still revenue. It's about 160 plus a million. And so of that, we're confident that we have the 40 million. And so hoping that the votes will come in to be able to ensure that this goes to the districts. And this was a result of these listening tours, actually, because what we heard from every superintendent is, I'm glad we're thinking about a real sort of structural change for the future, but what about now? We expected to get 75% back, 72% back, and now we're getting 60% back. We didn't budget for 60%, we budgeted for 70%, and even maybe we budgeted for 68%, but now we're getting 62%. So what do we do? How do we make up that gap? That's what this $40 million, it's just making up the gap in this current budget cycle. And then importantly, as a committee, what we're looking to do is to look at long-term structural changes that make special education sustainable in Connecticut. And that's something that hasn't been done before. And that's why, we're signaling both that this is by this being a legislative priority, but also by creating this select committee, and by now supporting this money in this current budget cycle, signaling that, we're hearing this message that everybody has said we have these shared concerns, we need to act now. So one, we're actually acting now, and two, we're thinking about not just acting now as a quick sort of Band-Aid solution, what are some long-term structural changes that will improve the system overall? And that's what we're doing as a committee.
And I want to get a little bit more into that if we have time, but quickly with this additional $40 million for this year too, to fill that gap. How is this money going to be doled out? How is it going to be distributed to districts? And what will it be specifically used for? Are there any stipulations attached to this of what it can or can't be used for?
Yeah, so it's going to go back into the tiered system that currently exists. So, the districts were not able to get the full funding that they have back. So districts are first spending on students, so we have both an education cost sharing formula, and what we're talking about here is an excess cost reimbursement. That's a program when school districts are spending 4.5 times the amount of the average per pupil expenditures. Now they're entitled to that reimbursement. So they're not even entitled to the reimbursement until they spend 4.5 times the amount of the per pupil. And of that amount that they've spent, it's based, what they actually get reimbursed is based on the funding that's been allocated.
Right.
And that's why they're getting back, we thought given the funding that we had allocated, you would be getting back, 82% or 75%. Right. But actually it turns out because the costs have increased, they're only getting back 62%. Right. And so that's the gap we're trying to fill. So it will still go back into that excess cost grant reimbursement. And then the school districts can decide on transportation, we have to spend it on other I think the superintendent of West Hartford said they've been paying for therapeutic services, that they need that funding to offset the funding that's already been coming from the district.
Right.
But it'll go back into the formula and go back to that tiered system.
Gotcha. So really quickly in our last 2 minutes here, you mentioned long-term solutions, looking at that as well for this session. I know in response to this announcement, Republican leadership put out a statement saying this funding is welcome, backing this funding, but blaming Democrats for the current budgetary challenges municipalities are facing. What's your response to that? And can you share a little bit of insight on the long-term goals that the committee is looking at for this session?
Absolutely. Well, one, I should say that education is really not a partisan issue. And I have to say, I love this committee, but we really are working in a bipartisan fashion because we have a shared commitment to support, to the extent possible, special education, whatever we can fund. And we're looking at every sort of structural solution. So thinking about those outplacement costs, increasing the teacher pipeline, helping make sure that paras feel like they're supported in the classroom. We're looking at it holistically. We're looking at the entire package. And we have a shared commitment to that. I would say that's a bipartisan commitment to that work. And that's really important because as we're kind of negotiating what the solutions will be, it's important that we have that shared commitment, which I believe we do in the committee. It's a wonderful committee that we're working towards that goal. So there may be disagreements of where we should prioritize that spending and how we should spend, but we're all committed to making sure our students get what they need. And within the budgetary constraints that we find ourselves in, how do we provide that in a way that will provide a long-term solution?
Absolutely. And Senator, there's so much with this, but I appreciate you sharing a little bit of insight. I will be following this committee throughout the session.
Yes.
We're just in February. We know that the House and the Senate will be voting on this money tomorrow and Tuesday, hearing a bipartisan support for that. But thank you so much for taking a couple minutes.
Right. Thank you very much for having me.
Of course, we appreciate it. That does it for us now here on The Real Story. But if you want to watch these segments again, you can head to fox61.com or download the Fox 61 News app and watch Real Story every Sunday at 10 a.m. right here on Fox 61. Have a great morning.